Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China, Where to Go From Now, organized by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Uyghurs and the Coalition for Genocide Response. My name is Evelina Ohab and I am the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response and secretary to the APPG on Uyghurs. I'm joined by the co-founder of the coalition, Luc de Pulford, and our colleague Anton de Piro, and a distinguished panel of experts that I will introduce shortly. Over the recent months, more and more evidence has been coming to light about the atrocities against the Uyghur Muslims in China, including of arbitrary detention of over 1 million Uyghur Muslims, killings in detention, torture and inhuman treatment of detainees, the forced separation of children from their parents, forced sterilization, forced labor, forced organ harvesting, and forced disappearances, and much more. Despite concerning reports of atrocities that may be classified as crimes against humanity or even genocide, states continue to shy away from enforcing accountability, often putting their economic interest first. However, it is the responsibility of all states to take all available measures to prevent any violations of international law from occurring, to seek to bring such violations to an end, and seek justice for the victims and survivors. In July 2020, the Bar Human Rights Committee, human rights arm of the Bar of England and Wales, published a briefing paper, Responsibility of States under International Law to Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, China, mapping the avenues for legal recourse for states to undertake to bring those responsible to justice. The report makes several recommendations, which are not exclusive to the UK. Among others, it recommends that states engage in dialogue with China, calling upon it to cease and desist all and any violations of its obligations and responsibilities under the relevant treaties. Considering that China continues to deny any wrongdoing, it is unlikely that this step will be taken. The report recommends, among others, that we maintain and utilize international bodies to carry out investigations and due diligence in respect to China's alleged violations of its obligations and responsibilities concerning its Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim populations, for example, by ways of supporting and assisting independent, impartial, and international mechanisms to carry out investigations and determine comprehensively any violations by China. Considering the powerful position of China in the world order, including at the UN Security Council, it is unlikely that decisive action will follow to address the crimes, for example, at the UN Security Council. However, this does not mean that there are no options. And indeed, the panelists will discuss the options that can be taken or should be taken in the case. Today, you will hear from Alistair Carmichael MP, member of the UK House of Commons and co-chair of the APPG on Uyghurs, Lord Alton of Liverpool, crossbench peer at the UK House of Lords and patron of the Coalition for Genocide Response, Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, British barrister and former prosecutor at the ICTY, Nuri Turkel, US-educated Uyghur American lawyer and a commissioner with USERV, and Erin Farrell Rosenberg, senior advisor at Ferenc International Justice Initiative at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide. And now, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Alistair Carmichael MP. Alistair, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Evelina. We are challenged to think today about where we go next. And I think it is absolutely the central question in this area of international law and relations. But I think it is actually worth reflecting just very briefly on where we have come from in order to get to where we are today. I first sponsored a debate in the House of Commons in January of 2019, which was something I was motivated to do by a short item on BBC Newsnight by John Sweeney, about 7-8 minutes. And that was the first point at which I had become aware of what was going on in Xinjiang province. And it felt like a fairly lonely furrow that we were ploughing at that point. There wasn't a great deal of attention. but there was some interest, and on the back of that interest, we wrote the opinion pieces for the newspapers. And then, of course, in time, and especially as China then started or racked up the oppression of people in Hong Kong, which attracted more attention in the Western developed nations and what was going on there, we got a bit more attention, and actually it snowballed. So that now, today, what, 18, 20 months on from that first debate, you have a much wider pool of public knowledge. So I think what the first part of my answer is, where do we go next, is that we keep doing what we're doing. We just do it more frequently and at greater volume. And that is, we go out and we talk about it. We talk about it wherever and whenever we can. Remember just exactly what we are talking about here. We've got over 1 million people in Xinjiang province detained arbitrarily, and they're, while in detention, subject to something that is frankly brainwashing. You have the most oppressive scheme of mass surveillance to be found anywhere in the world. There are reports of organ harvesting and slave labour of those who are in the Turkic population. So that is something that needs to be spoken about. And it is something that cannot be ignored, and it can't be put on the back burner because we've got a trade deal or a trade delegation or whatever the next excuse it is going to be. So, you know, we, all of us, have a duty to talk about what we know, so that nobody will ever be able to say, when eventually the whole legal and judicial process catches up with what we know now and does call it out for what I believe it to be, which is a crime against humanity and very probably genocide, then nobody will be able to turn around and say, we didn't know, nobody told us. So how do we tackle the behemoth that is Chinese influence in the world? Well, let me parenthetically say, I think it would be an awful lot easier if we'd started tackling it 10 or 20 years ago, instead of a time when people like myself were told or asked lightly to, yeah, wind your neck in, that, you know, we've got a visit from the Premier, so we're going to hide away the demonstrator, or we don't want to meet the Dalai Lama because that would end our visiting delegate, or it would affect our relations with China. So, you know, we could have been in a strong position, but we are where we are. And I think we talk, first of all, first, last, and always for me, about human rights, because human rights are universal, and if they are not worth anything in Xinjiang, if there's something that can be relegated to relative position, then frankly, we risk them not being worth anything in our own country, and it rapidly then becomes a race to the bottom. We can talk about and we can support in any way possible the work of Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, from whom you will hear in a few minutes, with his China Tribunal, taking a holistic, detailed and legalistic approach to gathering and examining the evidence here, because getting that evidence and bringing it together in a credible way is going to be absolutely critical to ensuring that the multilateral institutions act. Because no individual country can take on China. Taking on China is something that has to be done multilaterally by all those countries who care about human rights, who will not walk by and ignore every evidence that points towards genocide and crimes against humanity. So we in this country, in the United Kingdom, have a particular opportunity now, because we are just been elected for the next 2 years to be part of the UN Human Rights Council. I know the difficulties in working through multilateral institutions, but if you accept in the first place that you need multilateral action, then frankly, I don't see any other way of doing it. Is it going to be easy? Almost certainly not. But you know, I was just thinking today, I was cutting my political teeth in the late 1970s and early 80s, when our politics in this country were dominated by the Cold War, the Berlin Wall down the middle of Germany, and apartheid in South Africa. And everybody told us that these massive issues at their day were impregnable. We would never shift them, we would never change them. And that remained the received wisdom right up until the moment when these edifices crumbled and when Nelson Mandela walked out of prison, we saw the Berlin Wall coming down the east. So change is possible, and change, in fact, I would say is not just possible, but if people are prepared to work for it and argue it and to campaign for it, then it is inevitable. And that's where we, each and every one of us, if we care about human rights and if we care about the rule of law, have not just the opportunity, but the duty to do so. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions come that point and proceed. Thank you, Evelina.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And I would like to give the floor to Lord Alton of Liverpool.
Oh, thank you very much, Evelina. It's a great pleasure to follow my friend Alistair Carmichael and to be the curtain raiser for another friend, Sir Geoffrey Nice QC. It's a great pleasure to join you for the webinar, and I'd like to begin by thanking Evelina and the all-party parliamentary group on the Uyghurs, of which I'm vice chairman, and the Coalition for Genocide Response, of which I'm a patron, for bringing us together this afternoon for this very timely webinar entitled The Persecution of the Uyghur Muslims in China, Where to Go to From Now. Well, in Parliament, I first raised the plight of the Uyghurs as long ago as January 2008, and have done so on 34 occasions through speeches and questions in the House of Lords since then. In 2009, 1 year after I first asked the government to consider what was happening to the Uyghurs, I travelled to Western China and Tibet. During my visit, I went to the Great Mosque of Xinjing, the Dongguan Masjid Mosque, dating from the 14th century. It's one of the 4 largest mosques in northwest China and is the largest and most important mosque in Qinghai province. Enlarged in 1946, it serves as a reminder of the religious pluralism which existed within China before the coming of Chinese communism. And it reminds us perhaps also of something that Alistair mentioned a few moments ago about the importance always in our lives of freedom of religion or belief, the right to believe, the right not to believe, the right to change your belief, all of which are adumbrated in the Article 18 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So for me, the discussion today, like it is for Alistair, is a debate about fundamental human rights. I don't know what's happened to that beautiful mosque, to that building, but on a recent trip to the Nanguan Mosque in Yinchuan, United Kingdom's Deputy Head of Mission in China, Christina Scott, in a tweet deplored the changes to the religious buildings, saying, and I quote her, "Domes, minarets, everything gone. Of course, no visitors are allowed. So depressing," she said. That's our UK Deputy Head of Mission in China. But buildings are the least of it. Over recent months, we've been seeing reports shedding light on new evidence of the atrocities perpetrated against the Uyghurs. Each piece of evidence adds to the argument that the atrocities amount to international crimes and highly likely genocide, although the determination of the atrocities is yet still to be made. Her Majesty's government won't make such a determination because it insists that such a determination should be made by international judicial bodies, although such international judicial bodies may not always be in a position or indeed willing to do so. Because of the failure of the government to determine genocide and hold to account those responsible for such mass atrocities over recent years, I've been working on several legislative initiatives to address that situation. Among others, my proposed Genocide Determination Bill would invest the High Court of England and Wales, not politicians, with the power to make a preliminary finding on cases of alleged genocide and subsequently refers such findings to the International Criminal Court or to a specially appointed tribunal. The proposal responds to the argument of the government that the determination of genocide should be made by a competent court. The competent court here in the bill is the High Court, not an international court, and recognizes that under the Genocide Convention, it is the duty of the state, not international institutions, to act. The bill is still at a very early stage of the legislative process, but more recently I tabled an amendment to the trade bill, which is currently before the House of Lords. And it mirrors the Genocide Determination Bill in proposing a mechanism for the interim determination to prevent the government becoming complicit in such atrocities by doing business with states standing accused of genocide. The purpose of that amendment is to nullify trade agreements that have been made under the bill if the High Court of England and Wales makes a preliminary determination that they should be revoked on the grounds that the proposed trade partner has perpetrated genocide. It's interesting that only this weekend, Byline Times reported on a question which I asked here in the House of Lords about PPE made in slave labor camps by incarcerated Uyghurs in those camps, made and then bought by the United Kingdom and used here. The details of this are on my website. It's one of the reasons why this amendment is needed, but there are others. Not having a mechanism or procedure for genocide determination in place means not only that the United Kingdom is not able to tailor its foreign policy accordingly, but also that the UK is by default in breach of its international obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the 1948 Genocide Convention. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in its judgment in Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia and Montenegro, clarifies that the duty to prevent is a conduct-orientated, not a result-orientated duty. As such, and I quote, "A state cannot be under an obligation to succeed, whatever the circumstances, in preventing the commission of genocide. The obligation of states parties is rather to employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent genocide as far as possible," I close quotes. Genocide determination shouldn't be confused or conflated with the determination of such atrocities by courts for criminal prosecution of the individuals involved. The analysis and determination discussed here concerns the interim determination by states to inform their responses only and not to determine the criminal liability of an individual. So the Genocide Convention doesn't make it clear that state parties should conduct their own genocide determination. That is true. However, the fact that according to the ICJ, the duty to prevent is triggered when the state, and I quote, learns of or should normally have learned of the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed, ultimately means that states should have effective monitoring and determination mechanisms in place. Furthermore, the reliance on the international judicial bodies neglects the issue that often there are no bodies able to engage with the question. The UN established investigative mechanisms, ad hoc tribunals, and the ICC are the main international bodies most relevant to the question of determination of genocide. Historically, the UN Security Council, despite being reluctant to deal with the question of genocide, has undertaken steps to ensure that such a determination is made. Think back in the case of the mass atrocities in Bosnia, which Jeffrey will no doubt refer to in due course because of his own involvement in those trials, but Rwanda as well, which I visited in the aftermath of the genocide there. The UN Security Council established commissions of experts to examine and analyze the evidence and confirm whether the atrocities amounted to genocide. Once the committees of experts confirmed their findings, the UN Security Council then proceeded to establish ad hoc tribunals to deal with prosecutions of the perpetrators. But seriously, can you imagine them doing that, the Security Council, in the case of the Uyghurs, given that China has a right of veto? The determination and recognition of mass atrocities for what they are is not a matter of good practice only. It derives from states' international legal duties and is conductive and conducive of the duties to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. Indeed, Gregory H. Stanton, former research professor in genocide studies and prevention at George Mason University, conducted a study on the perception and effects of using the words ethnic cleansing or genocide. His research back in 2015 convincingly notes that recognizing mass atrocities that meet the legal definition of genocide as genocide has resulted in a more comprehensive response, including to stop the atrocities. Referring to such crimes as ethnic cleansing didn't have the same effect. As such, empirical reality suggests that there is a difference in the way different international crimes are being addressed by states. And certainly there is a radical difference in the way that we in the United Kingdom deal with these circumstances, hesitating most of the time to act. The mechanism for genocide determination, whether by the way of a genocide determination bill or by the amendment that I've moved to the trade bill, would equip the British government with a mechanism to trigger more comprehensive response to mass atrocities than is currently available. Understandably, this is a determination that doesn't necessarily mean action, but without this determination, there certainly won't be any action to stop the atrocities. And for me, it would be the proper and right beginning. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Lord Alton. And now I would like to give the floor to Sir Geoffrey Nice QC. Sir Geoffrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Evelina. Great pleasure to be with you on this occasion and indeed to follow Alistair and David. David's observations are those with which I can completely agree, and it's worth perhaps my just observing that it was working with him on the Genocide Recognition Bill and thinking more broadly about that in combination with one or two other vectors operating on me and a chap called Nick Vetch, who's operating, with whom I have created and am operating the Uyghur Tribunal, that the Uyghur Tribunal came into being. I can, of course, express no opinion on the merits one way or another of the issues discussed today, because I'm chairing a tribunal that will look at these matters and start from a neutral position with a blank sheet of paper on which evidence will be placed. It's worth saying something, but not very much, about people's tribunals in case any of those listening or observing are unfamiliar with them. They are no panaceas. They have a limited function, but their function can be very valuable in certain circumstances. Basically, they are created by people in different combinations and with different starting points, where there is an obvious gap left by national or international organizations, a gap in failing to answer a question that needs to be asked and answered. And that is why, if you look back, perhaps the most interesting and significant historical people's tribunals were, in date order, the Comfort Women Tribunal that dealt with the sexual enslavement of women to serve the sexual desires of the Japanese military. And that tribunal, reporting in 2000, found the emperor himself to be culpable. The Vietnam Tribunal, which is the first in time, although dealing with a later event chaired by Lord Russell that dealt with Vietnam, that has, for very obvious reasons, never been the subject of investigation, because the United States of America, against whom, or in respect of whom that tribunal was focused, nobody's ever investigated America for war crimes committed there. So those are gaps. And so far as the present matters of concern may be, they are also the subject of a gap, as the two previous speakers have both identified. If when tribunals of this kind reach decisions, and I chaired the China tribunal that looked into forced organ harvesting and that reported first in June of last year and then more substantially in written form in March of this year, when they report or provide a judgment, as we did, they're providing for others to use a fact established on evidence, the establishment of the fact coming through a public examination of the evidence, but a public analysis of the evidence. And if the fact cannot be disputed because the evidence is substantial and the argumentation beyond opposition, beyond argument, then that fact rests as something to be used, deployed, applied by those who have responsibility. It should bind them to act. And so far as governments are concerned, where conclusions by a proper people's tribunal identifying a duty or the need to honor an undertaking, as in the case of the Genocide Convention, if they are seized with such a fact, then either they respond to it or they can be seen by their electorates to be failing in their duty, with whatever consequences that may have for them as a government, and ultimately what consequences, good consequences, there may be for victim groups who are concerned. That same fact, established with that same degree of certainty, can influence those with choice. And I think already one question about companies' obligations. As we said in the previous tribunal, the China tribunal, we make no recommendations for what people should do, but a whole range of bodies seized with the conclusions of that tribunal, whether from universities or arts establishments, other educational establishments, schools, businesses, airlines, tourism, and so on and so forth, aware of the fact that is found, had to realize that in their interactions with the People's Republic of China, they were dealing with a criminal state. And that position being made apparent for them makes it highly possible, if not probable, and one would hope certain, that behavior of all those individual and separate institutions, groups and bodies and so on will or may change, may or will change. So far as this particular coming tribunal is concerned, it will, just as in all the other best tribunals of this kind, operate on a wide base of evidence, including evidence that might be favorable to the People's Republic of China, evidence that may justify the arguments they're already making public to explain their behavior. The tribunal members will not be specialists, not lawyers or NGO specialists or human rights specialists, but they will be people with wisdom and experience drawn from many walks of life in order to create that which has worked so well in other parts of our life and also in other parts of the lives of and societies of other countries, operate like a jury. Will bring together common sense, but also a range of different background experience and reasoning processes. And it will only reach conclusions if, on the evidence, it is satisfied to that very highest level of proof beyond reasonable doubt, that any of the allegations it is considering are proved. If they are proved, it will make a judgment to that effect. If they're not, then it will similarly make a judgment to the contrary effect, with explanation, full explanation in each case. So my last observation really arises from what David in a way invited me to touch on, which was Bosnia and Rwanda, and his recall of the committees of experts that preceded the establishment of the courts, the ad hoc courts as they are known, that the UN established in respect of both of those conflicts. He ended his observations by saying it's unrealistic to think that any such committees would be established because of the risk that they would have to make findings adverse to China. He may well be right, and I suspect he is, and if he is, then there will be no body filling the gap that we are otherwise filling. It's also worth observing that were any such body ever to come into being, then our work, substantial though it's been already, with a great deal more to come, might in a sense be over because we would be redundant. We don't seek to do things that other people still might do and could do. But that's not the way it's looking at the moment. And so we will, quite swiftly, by the end of next year, provide an evidence-based, well-reasoned judgment, one way or the other, on the factual and legal assertions being made very generally about the conduct of the People's Republic of China to its Uyghur and other Muslim minority groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. And now I would like to give the floor to Nuri Turkan. Nuri, the floor is yours.
What an honor to be part of this important conversation. I've known and met with you virtually or read about you, and I'm very pleased that I have this opportunity to share my thoughts and learn from you. I like to focus on a few things that had not been touched. We have seen some unprecedented historic policy and legislative responses here in Washington, particularly in the last several months. And I'd like to go through some of them along with some of the diplomatic, legal, and economic actions that other countries may be able to take as the United States government has done. We all know that China is a powerful global actor. Its influence is growing daily by operation of its wolf diplomacy now, vast trade network of disseminating irresistibly cheap products, ostensibly unconditional foreign aid, investment programs, soft power people-to-people exchanges, the Confucius Institute and COVID-19 diplomacy, you name it. It is also increasingly an added player on the international stage, particularly as it occupies the vacuum left by the United States retreat from multi. One year only witnessed a letter joined by 37 states last year, many of them Muslim majority, but the tide is turning. This year, there were 39 countries came out in defense of freedom for Uyghur people and people of Hong Kong and Tibetans, whereas 45 countries are still supporting Chinese, particularly on the concentration camp issue. Given China's burgeoning influence, it's easy to assume that there's no effective levers against it when it comes to human rights issues, be it the persecution of the Uyghurs, crackdown in Hong Kong, but such a defeatist attitude is understandable, but misplaced. There are a number of discrete and cumulative actions the United States, our partners, allies, and other members of the international community can take or undertake alone or in concert with each other to address this, this genocidal policies that the Chinese government is committing in a daylight. So some of the effective policy initiatives being introduced and implemented include sanctions. The United States has issued increasingly robust sanctions against China. So far, it has publicly sanctioned one government entity, Xinjiang Production Construction Corp., about 50 Chinese firms, 4 Chinese officials in connection with the human rights abuses in the Uyghur region. That includes someone really high up, a Politburo member, Chinese Communist Party Xinjiang chief, Chen Zhengguo, who used to be the head of the Communist Party in Tibet. And also someone by the name Zhu Hailun, who has been dubbed as the modern day Adolf Eichmann, who designed and promoted the collective punishment of the Uyghur people. Current administration's recent actions on the Uyghur issue are welcome, but they are came very late. I say this because we've been advocating for policy responses as early as 2018, spring 2018. As you may recall, Ambassador Sam Brownback, who is in charge of international religious freedom, told the reporters that the Magnitsky sanction should be the first initial step to address the atrocities. But it did not happen. That policy recommendations were not taken up, implemented until early this year. The United States can do several things, along with its partners and allies, to magnify the impact or the policy and legislative initiatives and mandates have been put in place. As you know, that the United Kingdom, Canada, and several other countries have a similar measures, legal tools, such as the Global Magnitsky Act, that should be utilized. So far, UK has targeted individuals in Russia, Myanmar, DPRK, Saudi Arabia, in a way that mirrors the US designation. The same should be and could be done with respect to Chinese human rights abusers. And also the inaction of and enabling by the governments of Muslim majorities and majority states in the face of China's actions has been remarkable. It's almost embarrassing to the extent. I am a part of an international religious freedom commission, and my fellow commissioners, none of them are Muslim. They fight for the Uyghur religious freedom, whereas we cannot have the similar type of commitment from other government officials around the world, particularly from the Muslim countries. The United States should continue to encourage its Muslim majority allies to be more outspoken in defense of the Uyghurs and the other religious minorities in China. We welcome Secretary Pompeo's recent trip in Indonesia, highlighting religious freedom for the Uyghur people and encouraging the Muslim majority countries to get on the right side of the history. And the other work that we should also look into, based on what we have been reading about the incoming administration, and this area is something that they are going to be focused, which is multilateral efforts. As previous speakers mentioned, China can control the UN Security Council through the exercise of its veto, but it does not enjoy this prerogative, this kind of a privilege or authority, influence in other multilateral fora, such as UN General Assembly. The last year's UNGA was very successful. I attended and participated in several side events that the United States, UK, Canada, the Netherlands co-hosted, which at a large attendance, and it has been very effective. Last year's UNGA also very effective tool for the United States and its allies to tell the world, particularly Central Asian Turkic states, that they should start paying attention to these issues because their own citizens also affected. As you may know, a sizable Kazakh population also have been affected by the ongoing atrocities. So the United States leaving the Human Rights Council was a mistake in 2018, which has significantly weakened the US influence in this important forum. I personally have been advocating in my official and personal capacity that the United States government should consider rejoining this important organization. And also, United States also have taken a number of significant steps by joining some of the world entities, international entities, organizations, newly formed organizations, That includes the Interparliamentary Alliance on China that our friend Luke was spearheading early on. We have several influential members of Congress, Senators Rubio, Menendez, a part of this effort, that this organization should be utilized to advocate policy, legislative initiatives and mandates in various capitals. The World Bank should be also playing an important role. CECC, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, pointed out through a public documents after being able to obtain some documents that show that the China has used World Bank financed projects to purchase facial recognition technology and night vision cameras. Although China is no longer a developing nation, ironically still borrows heavily from the World Bank at below market rates. Supply chain export control trade measures. I think one of the most pressing issues that the international community is facing is the polluted global supply chain, thanks to China's bringing back the modern day slavery, enslaving the Uyghurs who were previously in the prison camp, later the concentration camps. When they said that they are graduating Uyghurs from the camps, meaning that they're transferring most of them into either real prison camps with any sentences anywhere from 10 to 15 years, or to forced labor camps. China's government has implemented a vast system of forced labor in the region as part of its repression policies that supplies much of the world cotton. 22% of the cotton products made in China or sold around the world are sourced in the Uyghur region. China is also transferring Uyghurs to factories around the country. This is not only happening in the Uyghur region. Supply chain that starts in the region and with the key global brands such as Gap, Adidas, Uniqlo, Tommy Hilfiger, and the US markets. Recently, Center for Strategic International Studies published a policy paper. It states that during the period of April 2019 through April 2020, the exports from Xinjiang to two countries in particular has increased over 200%, namely to Italy about 199%, to the United States 250%. This should disturb the consumers. While the media scrutiny and the governmental papers and NGO papers and reports and public statements being made, the United States remain to be the largest destination for Xinjiang produced products. And this will have a large and immeasurable effect to a consumer as well as the economic health of various countries. The United States government rightly issued business advisory, which is, as you know, is non-binding, and this should be upgraded through enactment of an executive order or other binding regulations. This is something that the Biden administration will need to address. And also the sanctioning of this paramilitary business entity, believed to have over 800,000 shell companies around the world, was the right decision. This has already resulted in a larger fashion retailers such as Lacoste, Adidas, and Calvin Klein committing to cut ties to suppliers in the Uyghur region. We've been hearing similar commitment from Amazon and Nike as well. And going forward, the incoming administration or the current administration could convene the 10 biggest firms with a presence in the region to discuss the protection that they have put in place or should put in place to ensure goods products through persecution are not produced by the US firms or sold within the United States. The similar measure should be considered and done in Europe, particularly in European Union. We have bipartisan and bicameral support on this particular issue in the United States Congress. Recently, United States Congress passed voted on Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is currently being considered in the US Senate. It is anticipated that this bill will be voted on either during the lame duck session or early next year. And finally, in-house atrocity crimes determination. Previous speakers have mentioned various challenges and aspects of this important work. We have been, we means the user of the organization that I am serving as a commissioner, as a government entity that provides foreign policy advice to the state, Secretary of State, the President, and Congress, have been advocating Secretary Pompeo to officially designate or determine or label what's happening to the Uyghurs as a genocide. The United States has a Uyghur Policy Act that already requires the State Department to issue a report on the existence, the persecution of the Uyghurs, and the existence of genocide indicators. The State Department has this powerful and very effective entity, Intelligence and Research Center, that can conduct its own investigative report and provide credible, fact-based reports to the Congress and legal advisors, as well as the President, that can be used in genocide determination. We're very grateful to the effort by the Holocaust Museum. Holocaust Museum has been organizing events and also put this issue on its website. It has warned that crimes against humanity is underway in the Uyghur region. I'm sure that Erin will talk about this in her remarks. And then finally, I will conclude with mentioning something rather easy and doable: humanitarian assistance. 1951 Refugee Convention compels and prevents states to send anyone who is facing persecution to the country of origin. We have seen and witnessed countries, even to this day, repatriating Uyghurs back to China. It initially was Central Asian countries, South Asian countries, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. But now that the list is growing, the Middle Eastern countries, the Egypt, repatriated or forcibly removed a significant number of Uyghur students from their universities and sent back to China. And they are believed to be in the camps because of their religious training in Egypt with legally issued visa and passports. And also, as early as 2 weeks ago, the Indonesian government, believed to be reportedly repatriated or deported several Uyghurs back to China. So the countries should have, especially the Western democracies, should have a measurement or legal tools that should prevent this kind of events from taking place. Even Germany made a mistake, quote unquote mistake, by sending someone who was applying for asylum back to China, claiming that their fax machine was broken. Ever since, Germany said that they're not going to send any asylum applicants back to China. And Sweden made a pledge that they will be granting refugee asylum status to the Uyghurs in their country. The United States is actually should do and could do more. There are about 800 to 1,000 Uyghur asylum applicants who have been still waiting for the asylum application to be adjudicated. I don't know how much time do I have, but then finally, I'm sure that we will talk about accountability options that I could address during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuri. And now I would like to give the floor to Erin Farren Rosenberg. Erin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ewelina. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I give my remarks, I did just want to thank you, the co-host, and the very distinguished panelists who I'm quite honored to be here with you today, taking part in this very important conversation. As has been mentioned, my name is Erin Rosenberg. I work at Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, which is a part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Simon Scott Center's mandate is to alert the United States conscience, to influence policymakers, and to stimulate worldwide action to prevent and to halt genocide and related crimes against humanity, and finally, to help pursue justice and accountability when these crimes have already taken place. The Simon Scott Center began working on the situation of the Uyghurs in the beginning of 2018. And originally we looked at it from the perspective of our early warning project. This is when we conduct research prior to atrocity crimes occurring. However, we quickly determined that this was not the right framework to analyze the situation. And so instead, we brought together a group of legal experts and essentially carried out an analysis in terms of trying to understand what was actually happening in Xinjiang and what crimes might be at issue. We have used two different legal frameworks, and I will just touch on both of those briefly in terms of what we are looking at and how we understand the situation. The first is from a crimes perspective. So along with the legal experts that we work with, we analyzed a number of disclosures that I'm sure many are familiar with, but just to refer to them, the China cables, the Carmichael list, and most recently information that has been released regarding the birth control policies being put in place in Xinjiang. I want to highlight just at this moment that the information that was made available in the China cables, the Carmichael list, is information that was brought out by incredibly brave individual Uyghurs. China has continued to refuse to address what is happening. And of course, as I think everyone is aware, China denied the very existence of the detention camps until confronted with irrefutable evidence that this was occurring. So on the basis of this disclosed information, in March of this year, the Holocaust Museum determined on a reasonable basis that there's a reasonable basis to conclude. And I want to be clear that this is not a conclusion to the criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt, but a reasonable basis to conclude that China is committing the international crimes against humanity of imprisonment or other severe deprivations of liberty, and the crime against humanity of persecution. Following the most recent disclosure and a legal analysis that was carried out, the center has also determined that there is a reasonable basis to conclude that China is committing the crime against humanity of enforced sterilization. The act of enforced sterilization is not only a crime against humanity in and of itself, but it also, in the view of the center, is an underlying act of the crime of persecution. And for those who are not lawyers, I'm just going to very briefly explain, try to demystify a bit. And for the lawyers, don't hold me to this because this is not a legal explanation. But the crime of persecution, one way perhaps to just understand what I mean when I say persecution, is to think about it like bullying. When we use the term bullying, we might be talking about someone who is physically violent, verbally abusive, possibly taking the property of another person. All of those individual acts have names, right? But when you're doing that to harass a person, that's when it becomes bullying. Persecution is the same. It is an underlying criminal act that is carried out not simply to do that act, but with the intent to persecute or terrorize, if you will, the group as a whole. So in the view of the center, the acts of the discriminatory laws banning the use of the Uyghur language, banning Uyghur dress, everyday behaviors, the requirement of providing personally identifying biometric data, the destruction of religious sites, the imprisonment and arbitrary detention, and the enforced sterilization are all acts of persecution being directed against the Uyghur population. I want to also just mention or sort of underline the point that crimes against humanity are some of the most grave and serious crimes known to mankind. They cause severe harm, not only to the direct victims, but to entire communities. And the trauma from those crimes can endure across generations. These are very, very serious crimes that in the preamble of the Rome Statute are acknowledged as being crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. And so in their own right, just to be clear, as crimes against humanity, it is important that we do not downplay what that means, that a crime against humanity is being committed, and that we recognize the severe harm that these crimes cause in their own right. However, and this brings me to the second legal framework, these are not only extremely serious crimes in their own right, they also are risk factors for the crime of genocide. And so that is the second part that I will just briefly touch on. As Lord Alton mentioned, the International Court of Justice in Bosnia v. Serbia clarified that in terms of the obligation to prevent, that this obligation is triggered when a state knows or should have known of a serious risk of genocide. This means that the obligation to prevent, which is a part of customary international law, is triggered by definition prior to there needing to be a determination that genocide is occurring. Prior to genocide actually occurring, there is an obligation, once there is a risk of genocide, for states to identify those risks and take proactive steps to mitigate them. Now, this jurisprudence is incredibly clear. However, what is much less clear is what is a risk of genocide. The court, the ICJ, unfortunately has not provided a tremendous amount of information. However, we do have a framework by the United Nations Office for the Prevention of Genocide and the Responsibility to Protect, which is called the Atrocity Crimes Framework. That framework sets out 8 risk factors for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, and 2 risk factors which are specific to genocide. The second risk factor is a history of widespread human rights violations. And it is the view of the center that the enforced sterilization, the mass detention, the arbitrary detention, the persecution of the Uyghur people are not only crimes against humanity, but are clear violations of international human rights law. And as such, there is now, at this moment, a serious risk of genocide, which demands mitigating steps be taken, not only by China, but by all states. Because again, it's important to remember that the obligation to prevent genocide is an obligation that applies to all states. So I don't want to take up too much time, as I see we have a number of questions, but I would just simply conclude by saying, as a few recommendations that the center has would be, first, that governments should use the UN atrocity crimes framework to carry out a risk assessment of what crimes are at risk and to develop mitigation strategies. Second, they should, all states should support an independent and neutral body having access to Xinjiang in order to carry out investigations and determine with more precision the scope of what is truly happening. And finally, just to reiterate what the very important point that Nuri raised, which is to say that outside of the question of crimes and accountability and justice, we always have to remember that at the end of the day, we are talking about things that are happening now to people. And those individuals have to be at the core and the heart of any action. And so encouraging all states to develop refugee protection programs for Uyghurs who are fleeing or have been able to flee and are at risk of being returned to Xinjiang is incredibly important in terms of ensuring that, or attempting to ensure that the Uyghur people can be no longer victim to these atrocious crimes. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much again for allowing me to participate.
Thank you very much, Erin, for your wonderful presentation. And now, before we proceed to the questions and answers, we would like to give the floor to another member of British Parliament who is here with us, Lynn Brown MP. Just try to connect with Lynn.
Hi, sorry, I certainly wasn't expecting to have to put myself on video. I've sat here, I arrived late, so apologies for that. And basically what I've heard is that we're still amassing evidence. It still isn't legally proven, and if I've misunderstood, I apologise. And that we need to take action now to protect those who are fleeing, in order to give them safe haven and to treat them as they should be, as refugees. I am a little frustrated sitting here, I must admit, because I fear that we're seeing the systematic destruction of a people and a culture, and I think it's urgent action that we need to take. So I'd like to ask the panel, really, what is it that we can do right now that helps in the situation with the Uyghur population? What more can we do to identify UK companies who are implicated in Xinjiang? And also, I suppose, we have an opportunity because of what happened last week, despite the fact it's denied by the current president of the United States, but there is a new president-elect in the United States of America. What difference will Biden's election make? Or what difference can we get Biden's election to make to this very vulnerable community? I've just got questions and I'm afraid, and a little bit of frustration building here. And I just would like us to get to a position where we can start to think about what we can do rather than to wait to amass more evidence. I just feel that the evidence is there and we need to take some action. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. If I could maybe ask Sir Geoffrey to start with. You're muted.
You can ask me, but I think this is really a question for others, because a People's Tribunal should be, and ours is, not activist in any sense. Once it becomes activist, its judgment may be more easily criticized. And so we aren't able to deal with the very understandable questions that are asked. Trust us, we're doing our work as quickly as we can and bringing a judgment in by the end of next year, possibly with interim judgments next summer. We could not move faster. We're moving far faster than any international court would ever move. But I'm afraid this question has to be for those with political clout and experience.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. If I could direct the same question to Alistair and Lord Alton, please.
Yeah, thanks, Evan, and thank you. I'm going to have to drop off in a few minutes because I have another Zoom. Like everybody else, I'm suffering death by Zoom these days. Lynn, listen, thank you for your engagement, because actually, like me, you're in an enormously privileged position in that you have the Forum of the House of Commons and the ear of government ministers and the rest of it to push for that action. Essentially, as Sir Geoffrey just said, this is a political question. And although a government cannot make a legal determination for of what is genocide or what's a crime, we all know that these words don't just have a legal meaning, they have a normal everyday meaning as well. And, you know, the old line was rarely truer, that if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. And I mean, you may have seen the urgent question we had last week on Hong Kong, in fact, but in relation to Magnitsky sanctions. Nigel Adams was given a very measured, typically Foreign Office line, all very reasonable, and you know, very little that you could challenge on an intellectual basis, because you could see the logic of the argument. You don't want to be advertising to people that you're going to come after them for Magnitsky sanctions, and that risks diminishing the effectiveness of the sanctions. But, you know, to suggest that somebody like Carrie Lam, for example, hasn't twigged that she may at some point be the subject of Magnitsky sanctions, I think, you know, that moment has passed. We've lost the element of surprise there. But for the UK government, for our Foreign Office to be actually out there saying, well, we not got there yet, but this is where we want to go, I think that politically that would be very important. And but you know, look, this is not new territory. We've been around this 100 times before. There are still those who are saying to me, yeah, okay, you know, we get human rights are important, but could you just wind your neck a bit? I even get it inside my own party, but the answer is no.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And I'll give the floor to Lord Alton, please.
Well, it's a good point Lynn raises, which is what can we do now? I've been trying to do what I can here, Lynn, in the Lords, but in my own time when I was in the Commons, I mean, I would use all the facilities and procedures that are available to you as an MP. And Alistair's just referenced one of them, which is the ability to ask urgent questions, to table early day motions, to write letters to ministers, to ask for meetings with them, and all those things. But there are some legislative opportunities at the moment as well, Lynn, some of which will be in the Commons, some of which are here, and hopefully will come back to the Commons in due course. So I would refer first of all to the trade bill, which I mentioned earlier on. And I said also that I'd had a parliamentary question answered at the end of last week by the government about Medwell Medical Products, which is a British company that has been purchasing PPE made in China, but made by forced labor in the forced labor camps, by Uyghur forced labor. Well, not only are there implications here under the modern slavery legislation, obviously, but also we can, I think, start to ask some sharp questions about what are we doing sourcing so much from China when it's responsible for so many things. I mean, it's not surprising that the man who's actually in charge of Xinjiang province and who's personally responsible for many of the decisions that have been made there is the same person who was put in charge of Tibet. That was referenced by one of the earlier speakers. Well, a letter to Dominic Raab saying to him, Foreign Secretary, it's a good thing that you've done, setting up this Magnitsky list of people who will be sanctioned individually for the things that they have done. When are you going to put him on the list of people who will be sanctioned specifically? Now, I know for a fact that letters have already gone to the Foreign Secretary about that, and I think it would be really good, and if you were able to encourage colleagues to sign similar letters in the House and to send them to the Foreign Secretary. The medicines bill, Medical Devices and Medicines Bill is currently in the House of Lords. It was previously in the Commons, and your colleague, Mary Rimmer, moved an amendment to it specifically about forced organ harvesting. And Sir Geoffrey, as we all know, chaired this extraordinary tribunal, which said, without any hesitation, without doubt, at the end of its considerations, that these terrible crimes had been committed, primarily to Falun Gong practitioners, but Uyghurs were in the frame as well. So a cross-party group have been moving an amendment led by Philip Hunt, Lord Hunt of King's Heath in Birmingham, a Labour Member of Parliament, previously a Labour Minister, supported by Baroness Finlay, the former President of the Royal College of Medicine and the British Medical Association, by Lord Ribera, Conservative. He is a former surgeon, Baroness Northover, the Lib Dem Foreign Affairs spokesman in the Lords. So this is not just a few grumpy, idiosyncratic people. This is showing real breadth of political unity, wanting to do something about this and saying, you know, how can we be complicit? And once again, there are British companies who have manufactured some of the products that have been used in China for forced organ harvesting. So all of these are things that are coming your way. But then there's the telecommunications bill, the infrastructure bill. I moved amendments to the telecommunications leasehold bill. It's still awaiting a third reading because the government promised that they would put a human rights threshold into the legislation. They haven't been able to come up with the words yet. And they've drawn the title of the new telecoms bill very tightly so that companies will be able to continue getting away with human rights violations unless the detail is changed inside the bill. So I would say there's a whole long list of things that you can do. It's fantastic you're on the call. If you're not a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, Yasmin Qureshi, who's happily recovering after being affected by COVID-19, Yasmin is a wonderful chair of the group, and it brings together people of a like mind. And I think the more colleagues who participate from across the divide in both houses, the better it will be.
Thank you very much, Lord Alton. And just to confirm, Lynn is already a member of the APPG on New Uyghurs. And if I may give the floor to Nuri to comment maybe on the issue, what can we expect from the President-elect Biden?
Number one, continuity. Continuity is important. There are some policy advisors who have involved in President-elect Biden's team suggested that the current administration has been too tough. That concerns me on a personal and official level. It's not enough. You know, as Aaron perfectly pointed out, the entire Uyghur population around the world, including myself, suffering trauma, simply because what more world need to see in order to take an action? It's been too long. People are dying. Recently, Frontline documentary featured a Chinese security official. This documentary was made by a British documentary maker. You may have seen it. Initially, it was broadcast on ITV. And this security official said that we fooled the Uyghurs into believe that they will be educated in these camps. They're all gone mad. We cannot release them into the society. If we release them, they will become social criminal. That statement of itself is a chilling a testimony by a Chinese security official, the level and scope of the trust. This is an industrial level persecution. The Chinese government has been doing this. On the World's Watch, I appreciate all of you. I'm preaching to choir, but I'm trying to air my frustration and representing the entire Uyghur population around the world. It's a pastime for action. This is not even a controversial matter. This is not even when your kids end up buying, when you end up buying a baby pajamas, possibly made by Uyghur slaves. When you're buying a mask at a local pharmacy that you tried to protect yourself, possibly made by the Uyghur slaves. When you buy a wig to beautify yourself, possibly made by the Uyghur slaves, that in of itself is enough reason for you to act. And if these kind of things are not forcing you to act, then we have a serious problem with humanity. So this should be no-brainer. I think the European countries, particularly Germany, I have to name names, Germany, Belgium, France need to speak out. They need to actually lead the effort. When the United States alone spearheading the effort, it can be create negative result, thinking that this is all about Trump versus China. It's not Trump versus China. Even Trump was not in power. Even Biden is in power, protecting religious minorities in our gene. It's a first human rights. It's in a Declaration of Independence. This is in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. You know, any document that you flip through, you will find a text that compel the governments around the world to act. So either Biden sits in office and Trump sits in office, this is a matter of conscience. And I like to see, we've been pushing this, I'd like to see President Trump makes a determination before leaving office, because Biden already called this as a genocide. I would like to see Biden appoint a special envoy to address Uyghur genocide on day one through executive order. And I'd like to see a Biden administration convene an emergency session at the United Nations to discuss this. And I'd like to see a Biden administration send a representative to Organization of Islamic Conference that has been vacant to organize Muslim countries to speak out. This is disgraceful. The Islam has been perceived and called as a mental illness by the Communist Chinese government, and Muslim countries are not only coming out and speaking out against it, but also pampering Xi Jinping with a nice compliments. Even like the people like MBS, his name is banned for God's sake in China. Mohammed, if you name your child Mohammed, you will be in a concentration camp. If you greet your fellow Muslims, Assalamu alaikum, you'll be in a concentration camps. I mean, this is not exaggeration. We have even the Chinese government itself saying that they are trying to convert the Uyghurs into a normal human being by putting them through a re-education program by the staggering number. It's in the Chinese white paper. 1.3 million people have gone through the re-education program in the last 5 years. So the governments wake up. I'm glad I'm preaching to choir. I'm speaking to already to a group of politicians and legal experts who are already on this. But I like to see more people in various capitals. At least these five countries should convene emergency meeting right now, tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Nuri, for your passionate response and a to-do list for the future administration. That I think is definitely the right way forward. And now I would like to give the floor to Luke Depulford, who will continue with the questions and answers. We cannot hear you, Luke. No. Okay, unfortunately we cannot connect with Luke, and so we'll just continue with some of the questions. And I think one of the questions that we could start with is in relation to sanctions. And of course, for example, in the US, some sanctions have been already imposed upon some CCP officials, and in response, the Chinese government imposed sanctions against a number of US officials. In the UK, we are still not quite there, and such sanctions are being considered, but unfortunately not imposed yet. And maybe if I could give the floor to Lord Alton of Liverpool to mention some of the recent activities undertaken by Lord Alton and other peers, trying to get such sanctions being imposed against some of the Chinese officials most responsible for the atrocities against the Uyghurs.
Well, the first thing I'd like to do, Evelina, is to pay tribute to everyone who was involved in the campaign to convince the British government that this was something that we needed to do. And Bill Browder in particular, who has been so involved in taking on the Kremlin and fighting against the oligarchs and those who have corrupted so much of the business world of the former Soviet Union, of Russia. He has taken them on, even risking his own life in the course of that. And of course, Magnitsky was his lawyer. and he did lose his life. And I think, first of all, by going to the Americans and going to Congress, convincing them that this was something they should do, and then coming to us and other legislatures and convincing us, again, matters, opened up a new avenue for taking on people who are complicit in crimes against humanity, human rights violations, corruption, and ultimately the crime above all crimes of genocide itself. So this isn't a substitute for taking action under the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide, or indeed all the other obligations that are laid upon us. It's another weapon in our armory. And it was given full effect just before the summer recess here in Parliament. It was the very last item of business laid before the House, and it was unanimously agreed. The government, as recently as last week, the Minister, Lord Armid of Wimbledon, replying as Minister of State from the government front bench, declined to name any names of people who are being given, who are being considered, but he has got them on his list. That I am confident about, because we've had a conversation to that effect. Although I wouldn't expect him to give me the names of the people who are being considered, you can be pretty sure that some of those in places like Myanmar, who have been responsible for the horrors perpetrated against Rohingya Muslims, some of those in Syria and northern Iraq, who have been responsible for the horrors perpetrated against Yazidis and Christians and other minorities there, some of those in northern Nigeria, who have been responsible for the atrocities that unfold day by day at the hands of Boko Haram and now of ISIS West Africa. They will be on the list. And I am certain that some of those Chinese officials who have been responsible for events both in Xinjiang, but as Jeffrey Nice rather suggested earlier on, in Hong Kong as well, that it's undoubtedly the case that some of the things that Carrie Lam and others have been doing to Democrats, you only have to think last week about the removal of 4 elected legislators from the opposition, removed from office, turning this into one party, one system, rather than 2 systems, one country, taking away some fundamental rights of people in Hong Kong. But those responsible for breaking the basic law and the agreements that have been entered into the Sino-British agreement that created this wonderful set of circumstances for Hong Kong to flourish, the breaking of that, someone has got to be held responsible for it. And undoubtedly there will be people on that list as well. So it's still early days, Evelina, but the powers are now there. We know that the Foreign Secretary is keen to use them because he was lobbied hard, not just by Bill Browder, but by parliamentarians from both houses. And he is committed to this as well. Remember, he comes from a background which suffered. His family came out of Europe at the time of the Holocaust. And I think that within living memory, there are still plenty of people around who have personal experience of the horrors that occurred during that time and don't want it to happen all over again. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been regularly referred to, was born out of the ashes of Auschwitz. And we have to remember that it is our duty in our generation to make sure that we don't allow these things to simply happen in the way that Nuri was describing a few moments ago with great passion. Why aren't the Five Eyes countries? Why aren't the Islamic states? Why aren't all of us who have the right in the Security Council? We are a permanent member, like the United States and sadly China as well in the Security Council. But even if China uses its veto, put them on the spot and show that they have used their veto in order to stop proper consideration being given. What is the point of having an international criminal court if we can't even refer reports like the one carried out by Michael Kirby into horrors in North Korea, where he said it was a state without parallel? That report, which called for crimes against humanity to be investigated by the ICC, has never gone to the Security Council because everyone says, oh, China will veto it. Well, let them do that, and let's show them show the world what they are made of. This is a battle of hearts and souls and minds, and we've got to be rather better engaged in it than we have been hitherto.
Thank you very much, Lord Alton. And I would like to give the floor back to Luke.
Hopefully this is working. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks everybody. Look, a question about the UN. A few people have asked something similar. People are saying that with China's election to the UN Human Rights Council and their overwhelming majority, that obviously limits options at the UN around genocide determination. So the question, and I think I'll pose this to Erin, do you see there being any prospect at all within the institutions of the United Nations for genocide determination around what's happening in the Uyghur region? And if not, would you support or would you suggest or advocate another way? What other ways have we got, like, for example, bringing together D10, 10 democracies to try to pursue other methods, other avenues to get our genocide determination, in addition to what Sir Geoffrey's working on and what Lord Alton was working on with his amendments? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. Just to begin by saying that I think it's always important to be realistic and not raise expectations of people who are really desperate for some form of justice. So I think it's important to recognize the very real issues that surround the UN Security Council, China's role, and downplaying that can mislead people about what's really possible. That being said, there are other parts of the United Nations outside of the UN Security Council that can be activated. We heard Nuri already referring to the General Assembly, but we also, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has the ability to certainly press for access into Xinjiang and to be able to carry out investigations, as well as potentially to make some form of findings. The Human Rights Council potentially. So there are other bodies within the UN outside of the UN Security Council. And I think it's very important to highlight exactly what Nuri also said, which is that it's, sort of the real politique of it is that the Security Council may be very strongly influenced by China, but that does not mean that the rest of the UN security, or I'm sorry, the rest of the United Nations organs and agencies are the same. And so I think not letting up pressure, really looking at all of the different avenues. China is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture. They're not a signatory to the additional protocol, which causes a bit of a, unfortunately, which means there isn't an automatic monitoring and investigation mechanism. But you can combine, just to say, the fact that they are a signatory to the Convention Against Torture with political pressure, even if they are not legally bound under the additional protocol. And potentially you could also make some arguments regarding the customary status of what's occurring in China in terms of torture. So I don't want to say that there's a silver bullet to give you an idea that I know the solution or that anyone knows the solution. This is a very difficult situation given China's position of influence and power, but that's also not an excuse to not look for other avenues and to be creative. And I really want to salute what I've heard from the parliamentarians of the various things that are underway and are being attempted, because I think that thinking of the United Nations, but also thinking about sanctions at the state level and some of our multilateral organizations, all of these have to be really taken advantage of and used to try to change the situation.
Thank you. And I think just the final question then, and I'll pose this to Nuri if I might, trying to summarize some others. What can individuals do, individuals who are listening in on this? And I might just conflate that with another question, which is about human rights due diligence, obligations to place upon companies. Perhaps we could tailor that to consumers and what consumers can do who are listening to this call. Thanks, Nuri.
Thank you. Before I move on to that question, I quickly mention that actually the bigger problem that we have at the UN is the leadership. To this day, the Secretary General has not said a word. Yes, we understand that 1/3 of the UN operating budget comes from Communist China. That doesn't mean that you can just ignore the UN mandate. If you're serving in a high position as Secretary General, you got to say something. China's not going to fire you tomorrow. So I use this opportunity to call them out. I think that our representatives at the UN should continue to press Secretary General to show some leadership. number one. And then as for the individual response, I think as a consumers, as a citizen of the free world, could do a couple of things. One, stop buying at least cotton products made or exported from China, made by or exported from China. The chances of you buying the forced labor produced product is pretty high because over 80 global brands have been implicated in this. That includes companies like Volkswagen, Hugo Boss in Europe. H&M made a commitment that they are cutting ties with questionable suppliers. And also as a free citizen, you should call those politicians who have not taken a position. This should not be the only concern for Mrs. Lin, Lord Alton, or others. This shouldn't be just a matter for some members of Congress in the United States to concern. The same is true in Canberra, same is true in Paris, same is true in London. Everyone should, no one is going to be restricted from calling and demanding our representatives to do their job. It's so easy. So at least, and then finally, if you have extra funds available, support civil societies, the NGO groups that have been researching, documenting, and publishing amazing reports, namely Uyghur Human Rights Project based in Washington, D.C. They need lots of financial support. They have about 10 paid staff members working day in, day out in the face of this global challenge. So financial support, calling your representatives, and be a good consumer, buying slave-produced products are simple things that you can do.
Thank you very much, Nuri. Thank you very much, Nuri, and thank you. A big kudos to all our panelists, not only for the presentation, but above all for the work that they're doing on the topic to shed a light on the situation of the Uyghur Muslims, but also push for action. And I would like to thank also all attendees and the important questions. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I will see you at our next webinar. Just a reminder, our next webinar is tomorrow at 5 p.m. GMT. So please join us, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelina.